The plane touched down with a jarring thud, and Captain James Harper felt a mix of relief and anticipation flood his system. He had spent the last 8 months in the rugged mountains of Afghanistan, leading his platoon through firefights and ambushes, surviving on adrenaline and determination. Now, as he finally set foot on home soil, all he could think about was seeing his wife, Kimberly. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, the warm embrace, the soft kiss, the feeling of home wrapping around him like a familiar blanket. As he walked through the airport, his heart raced with excitement. He spotted Kimberly standing near the arrival's gate, her blonde hair catching the light, just as he remembered. But something was different. Her smile, usually so bright and full of love, seemed strained, almost mechanical. He shrugged off the feeling, convincing himself it was just the awkwardness of being apart for so long. After all, they had both changed in these months, hadn't they? "Hey you," James said, pulling her into a hug. The contact felt strange, her body stiff, her arms hesitant. He kissed her on the forehead, but she turned away slightly, just enough for him to notice. "Welcome home," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no warmth, no excitement, just the words, empty and devoid of the emotion he had been longing for. On the drive home, James tried to break the ice, recounting stories from his deployment, the camaraderie of his men, the near misses and victories. But Kimberly was distant, her responses clipped and vague. She kept her eyes on the road, nodding at the right moments, but it was clear her mind was elsewhere. When they arrived at their modest home, James felt a pang of unease. The house was immaculate, as always, but it felt cold, almost sterile. The framed photos on the walls, the ones of their wedding day, vacations, and the happy moments they had shared, seemed like relics of another time, another life. Kimberly led him inside, her movements quick and efficient, as if she was going through the motions rather than welcoming him home. She pointed out that she had prepared his favorite meal, but there was no joy in her voice, no pride in the effort. James tried to push away the nagging feeling in his gut, telling himself that it would take time for them to reconnect after such a long separation. But as the days went by, the distance between them grew. Kimberly was always on her phone, texting or scrolling through social media, even when they were supposed to be spending time together. She would leave the house for hours, claiming she was meeting friends or running errands. But she always returned late, with vague excuses that never quite added up. James, ever observant and detail-oriented from his years in the military, began to notice other signs, small things that, on their own, might have meant nothing, but together painted a disturbing picture. At night, as Kimberly lay beside him, her back turned and her breathing steady, James stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. The warm, loving homecoming he had envisioned was slipping further away, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. James knew that the battlefield wasn't the only place where he had to fight for survival. The day had been uneventful, the kind of day that James used to cherish after the chaos of deployment. He had spent most of it tinkering around the house, trying to reacquaint himself with the normalcy of civilian life. Kimberly had mentioned she'd be out with friends that evening, so he decided to tackle a chore he had been putting off, a leaking pipe in the basement. The basement was filled with the familiar scent of damp concrete and old wood. James knelt by the pipe, his hands busy with the wrench, but his mind kept drifting back to Kimberly. He couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him since his return. As he worked, the sound of footsteps above caught his attention. He froze, listening intently. Kimberly was home earlier than expected. He could hear her moving around the kitchen, the clinking of glass and the rustle of packaging. Then, her voice, a voice he hadn't heard in what felt like ages, floated down the stairs, cheerful and light, completely unlike the cold, distant tone she had used with him recently. Curiosity tugged at him. He left the wrench on the ground and moved quietly to the foot of the stairs. He was trained to be stealthy, a skill honed through years of military service. Every step was calculated, every movement precise. As he crept up the stairs, careful not to make a sound. From his hidden position, just out of sight, he could hear her clearly now. She was on the phone. her voice tinged with excitement. "I can't wait to see you again." She giggled, the sound like a dagger to his heart. "He's out of the house most of the time anyway. You should have seen his face when I told him I was going out with the girls tonight." Poor idiot believed me. James felt his blood run cold. He strained to catch every word, his pulse thundering in his ears. She was talking about him, mocking him, belittling him. His heart pounded, each beat hammering against his chest like a drum. "And you know what the best part about my lover?" Kimberly continued, her tone laced with a cruel glee. "He's such an alpha male. He can go 6 times without stopping. My dumbass husband is nothing compared to him. We've already planned to get rid of that loser. It's just a matter of time." The words hung in the air, echoing in James' mind like a death knell. He stood frozen, his hands trembling as the reality of the situation crashed over him. The woman he had trusted with his life was planning to betray him. And not just betray him, she was planning to destroy him. His thoughts raced. How long had this been going on? How could he have been so blind, so naive? The rage that simmered beneath the surface began to boil over, his hands clenching into fists. Every fiber of his being screamed for action, for confrontation, but he knew he had to be smart, to think clearly. This was not a battlefield where brute force would win the day. This was a war of cunning, of strategy. James forced himself to retreat back down the stairs, his mind spinning. The man who had led soldiers through enemy fire, who had faced death countless times, now found himself standing in the basement of his own home, shaking with a rage he could contain. But one thing was clear, this was far from over. James sat in the darkened basement, the chill of the concrete floor seeping into his bones. The silence around him was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the house's electrical systems. His heart, however, was anything but silent. It pounded in his chest like a war drum, each beat fueled by a rage he had never known before. This wasn't the anger of a soldier on the battlefield. This was something deeper, something far more personal. The words he had overheard replayed in his mind, each one like a jagged piece of glass cutting into his soul. "He's such an alpha male, he can go 6 times without stopping. My dumbass husband is nothing compared to him." Kimberly's voice, once a source of comfort and love, had turned into a twisted mockery of everything he had held dear. The woman he had loved, had fought for, had dreamed of returning to, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. James's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. He had faced death on the battlefield, had seen his comrades fall, had survived ambushes and firefights that should have killed him. But nothing had prepared him for this. This wasn't a battle he could win with a well-placed shot or a clever maneuver. This was a war of emotions, a war within his own home, and he had been blindsided. His mind raced, sifting through the years of their marriage, looking for signs he might have missed. The late nights, the sudden disinterest in their conversations, the way she had started to pull away long before he had left for his last deployment. It all seemed so clear now, as if he had been living in a fog, too wrapped up in his duty to notice his own life crumbling around him. James forced himself to take deep, measured breaths. He couldn't let the anger consume him. Not yet. He needed to think, to plan. He had spent years in the military learning to control his emotions, to channel them into something productive, something that would keep him alive. Now he had to do the same. But this time the battlefield was his own home. "They think I'm a fool," he thought bitterly. "They think I'm some dumbass husband, too wrapped up in my own world to see what's happening right under my nose." But they were wrong, so very wrong. They had underestimated him, underestimated his capacity for cold, calculated revenge. They thought they could replace him, discard him like he was nothing. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. James stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, every muscle in his body tense with barely restrained fury. His mind was already working, formulating a plan, a strategy. This wasn't going to be a simple confrontation where he'd storm in, demand answers, invent his anger. No, that would be too easy, too quick. He wanted them to suffer, to feel the same pain and betrayal that he was feeling. He wanted to dismantle their lives, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the ashes of their own deceit. You think I'm a dumbass, he thought, a grim smile forming on his lips. You're about to learn just how wrong you are. James walked up the stairs, his mind set on what he had to do. He was no longer just a soldier coming home from war. He was a man betrayed, a man wronged, and he was about to show them what true betrayal looked like. The anger inside him wasn't just boiling. It was turning into something far more dangerous. It was turning into resolve. The hours crawled by, each second feeling like an eternity as James waited for Kimberly to return. His anger simmered beneath the surface, cold and calculated. He could hear the front door creak open upstairs, followed by the soft pat of her footsteps as she entered the house. She paused in the hallway, no doubt noticing the eerie silence that had settled over the home. James was waiting for her in the living room, seated on the couch, his expression unreadable. The only light in the room came from a single lamp, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Kimberly stepped into the room, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw him sitting there, wide awake. She quickly composed herself, but he caught the brief flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "You're still up?" she asked, her voice as sweet as ever, masking whatever emotions lurked beneath the surface. James forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, couldn't sleep. Thought we should talk." Kimberly's smile wavered slightly, but she nodded, crossing the room to sit opposite him. "Sure, what about?" James didn't waste time with small talk. He leaned forward, his gaze piercing into hers. "Are you happy, Kimberly?" The question took her off guard. She blinked, her smile faltering as she processed his words. "What? Of course I am. Why would you ask that?" "Because," James said slowly, standing up and taking a step toward her, "I overheard your conversation earlier, the one where you were laughing about how stupid I am and how great your lover is." The blood drained from Kimberly's face, leaving her pale and stricken. Her mouth opened and closed, her eyes wide with shock and terror. "James the first," but before she could finish, James' fist connected with her mouth, the force of the punch knocking her out of the chair and onto the floor. She screamed, a sharp, piercing sound, as pain radiated through her jaw. Blood pooled in her mouth, spilling onto the carpet as she clutched her face in horror. James loomed over her, his expression cold and unfeeling, like a soldier staring down a defeated enemy. "You think I'm a fool, Kimberly? You think you can just misuse me like that?" Kimberly tried to scramble away, her hands slipping in the blood as she struggled to get to her feet. But James was on her in an instant, his hand gripping her hair and yanking her back. She cried out in pain, her body trembling as she realized there was no escape. "I'm not done with you yet," he growled, his voice low and menacing. He pulled her up, forcing her to face him. The fear in her eyes a reflection of the cold, calculated rage that had consumed him. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. The house, once a sanctuary, was now a battleground, and James was determined to emerge victorious. He had fought too many wars, survived too many battles, to let this betrayal go unanswered. And as he stared down at the woman he had once loved, he knew that the fight was far from over. Kimberly lay crumpled on the floor, her body trembling, tears mingling with the blood dripping from her mouth. The physical pain was sharp, but it was the fear in her eyes that gave James a twisted sense of satisfaction. His initial outburst had been raw, a visceral reaction to the profound betrayal he felt. But as he stood over her, the cold, calculating part of his mind took control. He knew that a single act of violence was not enough to satisfy the depth of his anger. No, what he wanted was far worse. He wanted to dismantle her life piece by piece, to destroy her world as she had destroyed his. James grabbed her arm and pulled her up with a roughness that made her gasp. He forced her to meet his gaze, his eyes cold and unyielding. "You think you can just leave me for him? Start a new life while I fade away into nothing?" His voice was low, each word laced with venom. Kimberly, her voice shaky and barely above a whisper, tried to plead with him. "James, please Shut the fuck up," he interrupted, shoving her away with a disgusted sneer. "You're going to pay for this, Kimberly, and so is your lover. You both think you're untouchable, but you have no idea what I'm capable of. Over the next few days, James's rage transformed into a focused, meticulous drive for revenge. He became methodical, approaching the situation like a military operation. He planned everything down to the last detail, ensuring that nothing would lead back to him. He was going to destroy them both, but he was going to do it in a way that left them with no escape, no hope, and no future. His first step was to gather all the evidence he could. He hacked into Kimberly's phone, a skill he had picked up during his time in the military, and began sifting through her digital life. Every text message, every voicemail, every photo. He devoured it all, piecing together the timeline of her betrayal. He learned the name of her lover, Mark, a smug corporate executive who probably thought he was invincible. James's anger deepened as he read their messages, full of promises, plans for the future, and cruel jokes at his expense. But knowing wasn't enough. James wanted to do more than just expose them, he wanted to ruin them. He began by compiling the most incriminating evidence and sent it, anonymously, to Mark's wife. He imagined the shock, the devastation, that would ripple through Mark's life. The affair would become public, a messy, humiliating divorce that would tarnish his reputation and drain his resources. James didn't stop there. He dug deeper into Mark's life, finding every skeleton in his closet, every business dealing that was less than above board. It didn't take long to find something: shady contracts, off-the-books payments, and questionable relationships with government officials. James leaked this information to the press, ensuring that Mark's career would be obliterated. But this was only the beginning. James was relentless, setting up fake social media profiles to spread rumors and lies about both Kimberly and Mark. He meticulously crafted posts and comments, painting them as untrustworthy, manipulative, and corrupt. Their friends and family began to distance themselves, influenced by the poison James had unleashed into their lives. The isolation began to take its toll, and James reveled in the knowledge that they were both suffering under the weight of public scrutiny and private turmoil. Everywhere they turned, they found hostility and suspicion. Their once comfortable lives were unraveling, their reputations in tatters, their social circles closing in on them. James watched it all unfold with a cold satisfaction, knowing that his revenge was far from complete. He wanted them to experience the slow, agonizing destruction of everything they held dear, just as they had done to him. And as he sat back, his plan in motion, James felt a dark, grim sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about taking back control, about ensuring that they could never hurt him or anyone else again. The fallout from James' meticulously crafted plan began slowly, like the first cracks in a dam. But once those cracks spread, the dam broke, unleashing a flood of ruin upon Kimberly and Mark's lives. Each day brought a new wave of consequences, each one more devastating than the last. Kimberly's troubles started at work. Whispers and sideways glances followed her through the halls. Colleagues who had once been friends now kept their distance. The rumors spread quickly, rumors of her affair, of the scandalous details that had somehow leaked out. The atmosphere became suffocating. She was called into her boss's office, where she was met with stern faces and an air of finality. They didn't mince words. Her reputation had become a liability, and they couldn't afford the scandal. She was terminated immediately, escorted out of the building like a criminal. The isolation was immediate and crushing. Friends she had once confided in stopped answering her calls. Her social media accounts were flooded with scorn and mockery. Every door she tried to open was slammed shut in her face. She was left alone, jobless, and drowning in the fallout of her own choices. The man she had planned to leave James for was now her only lifeline, and even that was slipping away. Mark's downfall was even more public. The anonymous tip about his extramarital affair landed in his wife's inbox with brutal clarity. She didn't wait for explanations or apologies. Divorce papers were served within days, and the story spread like wildfire through their social circles. The news reached his workplace, where his colleagues and superiors treated him like a pariah. His professional life crumbled just as quickly. The leaked information about his business dealings hit the press, leading to investigations and lawsuits. His company distanced itself from him, and clients withdrew their contracts. The empire he had built on deception and greed was collapsing, leaving him disgraced and destitute. James watched from a distance, his face a mask of cold detachment. He had orchestrated every detail, pulled every string, and now he was witnessing the fruits of his labor. But the satisfaction he felt was hollow. The anger that had driven him, the pain that had fueled his actions, had not dissipated. It lingered, a dark shadow over his thoughts. He had taken everything from them, but the emptiness within him remained. Despite the destruction he had wrought, James wasn't finished. He wanted to see their faces, to witness the moment when they realized who had orchestrated their downfall. He needed that final, crushing blow to truly feel vindicated. And so, he devised one last move. He reached out to Kimberly and Mark separately, crafting a message that played on their desperation. He framed it as a chance for closure, a final conversation to talk things out, and perhaps find a way forward. The invitation was for a secluded cabin, a place where they could meet away from the prying eyes of the world that had turned against them. Kimberly, with no job, no friends, and no future, was desperate for any chance at redemption, any hope that this nightmare could be resolved. Mark, his life in tatters, clung to the hope that this meeting could salvage something from the wreckage. Both of them, broken and defeated, accepted the invitation, unaware that they were walking into a carefully laid trap. James prepared the cabin meticulously, making sure every detail was perfect. He arrived early, checking the arrangements, ensuring everything was in place for the final act of his revenge. The cabin was sparsely furnished, the focal point being a single chair positioned opposite a large, stone fireplace. On the wooden table beside him, a handgun rested, its cold metal glinting faintly in the dim light. James sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames as they danced and flickered, their heat doing nothing to thaw the icy resolve that gripped his heart. He had gone over this moment countless times in his mind, preparing for every possible outcome. Now all that was left was to see it through. The sound of tires crunching over gravel broke the silence, followed by the faint slam of car doors. James didn't move, his eyes remaining fixed on the flames. The door creaked open, and he heard the hesitant footsteps of Kimberly and Mark as they entered the cabin. They stopped abruptly when they saw him sitting there, the gun in plain view. "Sit down," James ordered, his voice devoid of emotion, as cold and commanding as a general addressing his troops. They hesitated, exchanging fearful glances, but the silent threat of the weapon was enough to make them comply. They took their seats, their movements stiff and jerky, like puppets on frayed strings. James finally turned to look at them, taking in their appearances. Kimberly, with her tear-streaked face, looked nothing like the woman who had once held his heart. Mark, the man who had been so confident, so self-assured, now looked small and defeated. They were shadows of their former selves, the weight of their betrayal pressing down on them like a physical force. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" James asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you have any idea what it feels like to be betrayed like that?" Kimberly's eyes filled with tears, her voice quivering as she tried to plead with him. "James, please, we're sorry, sorry." James cut her off with a bitter laugh, the sound harsh and mirthless. "You're sorry? You weren't sorry when you were laughing about me behind my back. You weren't sorry when you were planning to leave me for him?" His gaze shifted to Mark, his eyes narrowing with contempt. "And you? You thought you could just waltz in and take what's mine? You thought you were better than me?" Mark's lips moved as if he wanted to speak, but no sound came out. He was too terrified to do anything but nod weakly, his face pale and drawn. James stood up, the movement slow and deliberate, as if he were savoring the moment. He began pacing in front of them, his mind a storm of emotions. The power of the situation, the control he held over them, sent a cold surge of satisfaction through him, but it wasn't enough. He needed them to understand the depth of their betrayal, the enormity of the pain they had caused. "James began, his voice measured. When I was out there, risking my life for this country, I used to think about home, about you, Kimberly. You were my anchor. The thought of coming back to you kept me going, kept me sane, but now I see it was all a lie." He stopped pacing and turned to face them directly, the intensity of his stare making them both flinch. "You betrayed me in the worst way possible. And for what? A cheap thrill? Some fantasy about an alpha male? You don't even know what real strength is." James reached for the gun, his hand closing around the grip. Kimberly gasped, her body trembling uncontrollably, while Mark sat frozen, his eyes wide with fear. "James, please," Kimberly whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't do this." James looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Don't do what? You think I'm going to kill you? No, death would be too easy, too quick. You both deserve to suffer, to live with the consequences of your actions." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I want you to understand something. I could end this right now, I could pull this trigger, and it would all be over for you, but that would be mercy, and you don't deserve mercy." James slowly put the gun back down on the table, leaning in closer to them. "What you're going to do is live. Live with the knowledge that you've lost everything, your reputations, your careers, your friends, your families, everything you've built, everything you've worked for, gone because you couldn't keep your desires in check." He straightened up, his gaze still locked on them. "You're going to walk out of here, and you're going to live with that shame for the rest of your lives. And if you ever think about coming after me, remember this moment, remember that I hold all the cards, I have the evidence, the power, and the will to ruin you even further if I choose." Kimberly was sobbing uncontrollably now, her hands covering her face as the full weight of their situation crashed down on her. Mark looked utterly defeated, his expression hollow, as if the life had been drained out of him. They had been completely outmaneuvered by the man they had once mocked and underestimated. "Get out," James said quietly, but with an edge that made them both jump. "Get out of my sight, and don't ever come near me again." They scrambled to their feet, desperate to escape the cabin and the man who had destroyed their lives. As they rushed out, tripping over themselves in their haste, James watched them go, a strange sense of calm settling over him. The storm of rage and pain that had driven him was finally subsiding, leaving behind a cold, calculated clarity. He had taken his revenge, and now, as he stood alone in the quiet cabin, he realized that he had become something else entirely, something far more dangerous than the man they had betrayed. In the days that followed the confrontation, a heavy silence descended upon James's life. The world outside continued as usual, but for him, everything had changed. He spent his days in a state of cold detachment, a far cry from the man he had once been. The remnants of his old life, the life he had shared with Kimberly, were swiftly being dismantled. James wasted no time in filing for divorce. He approached it with the same ruthless efficiency he had applied to his revenge. He had gathered enough evidence to ensure that the settlement would be entirely in his favor. There would be no alimony, no shared assets, no mercy. Kimberly would walk away with nothing, a fitting end to the betrayal she had engineered. When he finally met with his lawyer, the man had been struck by the lack of emotion in James's demeanor. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a cold, calculating resolve. James signed the papers with a steady hand, the act feeling more like closing a business deal than ending a marriage. He left the lawyer's office without a backward glance, knowing that the finality of the divorce would soon be another nail in the coffin of Kimberly's ruined life. The house was the next thing to go. Every room, every corner held memories, tainted now by the betrayal that had unfolded within its walls. James couldn't bear the thought of staying there, of living in a place that had become a mausoleum for his old life. He put it on the market, pricing it to sell quickly, and within weeks it was gone. The house was bought by a young couple, eager to start their life together, unaware of the dark history that came with it. James left with only the essentials, determined to leave as much of the past behind as possible. He relocated to a new city, one where no one knew him or his story. It was a clean slate, a chance to rebuild himself from the ground up. The anonymity of the city was a balm to his wounded pride. He found a modest apartment, decorated it sparsely, and set about establishing a new routine. He threw himself into his work, using the structure and discipline of his military training to keep himself focused. But even as he built this new life, a part of him remained anchored in the past, in the cold satisfaction of his revenge. James didn't completely sever his connection to Mark, though. He kept tabs on him from afar, watching as the man's life continued to unravel. The scandals that James had set in motion had taken on a life of their own, spiraling out of control. Mark was forced to resign from his position, his reputation irreparably damaged. His marriage, already teetering on the brink, crumbled completely, ending in a bitter, drawn-out divorce. Mark was left with nothing but the ashes of his once successful life, his fall from grace complete. But James wasn't content to let them simply fade into obscurity. He wanted their suffering to be a constant reminder, a lingering ghost that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. So he devised a way to keep their wounds fresh. He sent anonymous letters to Kimberly, cruel reminders of what she had lost, what she had brought upon herself. The letters were always timed perfectly, arriving just when she might have thought the worst was over. Emails were sent to Mark, filled with venomous taunts about his downfall, each one a reminder of the man who had orchestrated his ruin. James even arranged for a few carefully placed news articles, subtle enough to seem like coincidences, but powerful enough to keep their shame in the public eye. With each reminder, each cruel twist of the knife, James felt a dark satisfaction. He had destroyed their lives, but it wasn't enough to just walk away. He wanted them to know that their pain, their suffering would never truly end. They would carry it with them always, just as he carried the scars of their betrayal. As time went on, James found a twisted peace in his new life. The anger that had once driven him had cooled, replaced by a deep, abiding sense of control. He had taken back his life, his power, and he had done it on his own terms. But in the quiet moments, when the world around him was still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something vital had been lost in the process. The man he had been, the man who had loved and trusted so deeply, was gone, replaced by someone colder, harder, and infinitely more dangerous.